This week, we have to back up and revisit some news from last week. A misunderstood executive order signed by President Trump and a shooting at a kosher grocery store in New Jersey say a lot about how Jews respond to the news. Hint, we don't respond well. We cover this and bring some updates on previous stories coming up now. I'm Lev Gringaus, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. So before we get to our main story of Jews and the news, some quick updates on previous stories. The first headline, Israel is heading to its third round of national elections in under a year. For the past couple months, this podcast has been trying to explain the ins and outs of Israeli politics and the aftermath of what, in September, was the second Israeli national election in under a year. For more detail, feel free to take a listen to those older podcast episodes, but as a quick recap, Israeli politics are based on the Knesset, which is Israel's version of a parliament. There are 120 seats in the Knesset, and citizens' votes for political parties translate to Knesset seats for those parties. So the only way an Israeli government gets formed is when a party or a coalition of political parties has a majority of 61 seats or more. And after the first Knesset election this year in April, no coalition was formed, and the second round of elections were then held in September. Since the September elections, big surprise, no coalition was formed again. The two biggest parties, the right-wing Likud and the centrist Blue and White Party, could have joined in a coalition and together had 65 Knesset seats to form a government, but negotiations have regularly stalled over the fact that the leader of Likud, current Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, has been indicted by Israel's Attorney General in 3 corruption cases. Netanyahu's case is still pending and actually is delayed by the fact that there is no proper Israeli government right now. So after all this, last week on Wednesday, December 11th, the Israeli Knesset that was elected in September officially gave up and called for a third round of elections to be held on March 2nd, 2020. Polling suggests that almost nothing in the political gridlock will change in the third Israeli elections in under a year, so those of us who have the misfortune of keeping track are already planning for a fourth election. Imagining this bleak future, Israeli English-language TV anchor Eylon Levy joked on Twitter, quote, "The year is 2371. Israelis engage in a twice-yearly ritual called elections, a tradition whose origins nobody can recall. They assume someone tried to kill them, and they failed, so they eat." End quote. Alright, so on to headline number 2. The institutionally anti-Semitic Labour Party lost heavily in the British elections last Thursday, December 12th. So, last week's podcast was about the British national elections, and I talked about how British politics are largely between two main parties. The Labour Party, sort of like the Democrats here in America, and the Conservative Party, sort of like the Republicans. And I spoke about the Labour Party's issue with institutionalized anti-Semitism, seemingly encouraged by Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, and that, as a result, Jews were actively afraid of the possibility of a Great Britain led by Labour. Well, that has not come to pass. Labour has seen one of its biggest losses in decades, and the Conservative Party now has a majority government in the British Parliament. On one hand, many Jews are relieved by this result. On the other hand, Boris Johnson, the current British Prime Minister and member of the Conservative Party, is himself a racist and Islamophobe, and he has campaigned to take Great Britain out of the European Union, a move dubbed Brexit. Most Jews, incidentally, don't support Brexit, which is predicted to cause chaos for the British economy, and I would also like to think that most Jews are not Islamophobes as well, so the loss of the Labour Party and the win of Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party is definitely bittersweet. With those updates out of the way, let's dive into the main stories of the past week, and in doing so, there is a lesson to be learned about how Jews respond to the news about us. So last week, Tuesday evening, December 10th, the New York Times published a story that said Trump will sign an executive order on Wednesday, December 11th, that, well, let me just quote the line that got everyone riled up. From the New York Times article, the executive order would, quote, define Judaism as a nationality, not just a religion, end quote. Most Jews reading that jumped at the idea that President Trump would be using the power of the federal government to tell Jews what they are or are not. We've got a bad history of being singled out by countries and state powers in ways that usually didn't end up well for us. So I think Brian Kopelman, the co-creator and showrunner of the TV show Billions, summed up how many Jews were feeling when he tweeted, quote, "This executive order calling Judaism a nationality is truly the first step in a long con. If we accept it, we are saying we are not Americans, we are other, and can and should be separated. This is the banality of evil," end quote. But there's a problem here, and a pretty significant one. The New York Times mischaracterized the executive order. So let's get into what the actual executive order did and said, and then unpack the context of the order to understand why so many people, myself included, got riled up at this. Warning, some of this will be a bit dense, a natural part of the challenge of understanding government policy. So here's what the executive order does. Let's dive right into it. It gives the Education Department the power to withhold funding from colleges and programs that it thinks are discriminating against Jews. That power is based in Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, where the Education Department can pull funding if there is discrimination, quote, on the ground of race, color, or national origin, end quote. Now, religion isn't one of those categories, and Judaism is largely seen as a religion in the United States, not a race, color, or national origin. So how do you get Title VI protections of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to extend to Jews on college campuses? Well, you bring them under the umbrella of the three categories in the law. So here's some of the text from the executive order. Quote, "While Title VI does not cover discrimination based on religion, individuals who face discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin do not lose protection under Title VI for also being a member of a group that shares common religious practices. Discrimination against Jews may give rise to a Title VI violation when the discrimination is based on an individual's race, color, or national origin," end quote. Notice none of that is President Trump saying Jews are a nationality. That paragraph of redundant politician speak is actually lifted from a policy statement from 2004 during President George W. Bush's administration that was later affirmed in 2010 by the administration of President Barack Obama. In regular English, it's saying that Title VI protections apply to religious groups when discrimination is based on the perception of those religious groups as an ethnic group, or a group of the same national origin. So, for example, because anti-Semites see Jews as a group of people with the same national origin, we are protected by the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And it should be noted that this rationale for protecting Jews is also used to protect religious groups like Muslims and Sikhs. So I know that's some deep dive into policy, but the moral of the story is that no, the executive order doesn't say Jews are a nationality and actually uses pre-existing policy to extend anti-discrimination protections to Jews on college campuses. This, on its own, is not a bad thing, but context matters. So now it's important to go back to last week, Tuesday evening, December 10th, when the New York Times story came out. At that time, no one knew the actual wording of the executive order, so lots of Jews latched onto the way the Times described it, again inaccurately, as saying that Jews would be classified officially as a nationality. Many of us whipped ourselves into a panic over this, and those of us that did made a significant mistake in media literacy. We didn't wait. This gets to some of the complexity of the news provider and news reader relationship. Nowadays, it's all too easy to start screaming fake news at anything we think is inaccurate or not completely presented in the way we would have liked. Let's not slip into that paradigm. It is just a reality of the job that sometimes reputable news sources like the New York Times publish partial information. They were not wrong that there was an executive order by Trump that would extend Title VI protections to Jews. They were the first to report it. But the Times either didn't have or didn't publish the actual text of the executive order and were left to rely on descriptions given to them about it. This is news, and this is news in a 24/7 environment. They had the story, they published, because it's their job to inform the public of what is going on, even if the text of the executive order wasn't available to them. So it was mischaracterized as Trump makes Judaism a nationality. And what we as readers should have understood is that this was partial reporting. Particularly with something as crazy as this seemed to be, it was worth it to wait and see for ourselves the text of the executive order. And we didn't, which is why we're still having this conversation about an executive order that didn't actually do anything that crazy. Unfortunately, this lack of media literacy is common for all too many people, but I would argue it's particularly poignant for Jews, and it was compounded by the fact that most of the conversation around this executive order wasn't so much about what the order itself was and what it would do, and far more about this being Trump's executive order. As a reminder, I would argue that extending anti-discrimination protections to Jews is a good thing, however much I might feel it being slimy coming from the Trump administration. But I also can't dismiss that there were legitimate reasons, before the actual text of the executive order came out, for Jews to go, this is coming from Trump? This is the guy who said Jews who vote for Democrats, so 70% plus of American Jews, show lack of knowledge and great disloyalty. And this is also the guy who has proposed insane ideas like literally trying to buy the territory of Greenland from Denmark. So Trump signing an executive order saying Jews are a nationality doesn't sound so unbelievable. And it looks like the president is only singling out Jews for protection in doing so. It's also important to remember that Trump's politics are transactional. Doing this thing for the Jews as he sees it gives him more political leverage to go out in public and say, look how great I am and how much I love the Jews. But that's probably a bad excuse for not waiting to know more about the text of the order before going for the public outrage. Addressing this, the Forward's editor-in-chief Jody Ruderin tweeted, quote, Trump's executive order on Jews seems to be another example, at least on Twitter, of the growing inability to analyze news based on its substance rather than its author, for people to think about an idea rather than just essentially restating that they are pro or anti-Trump. Sad, end quote. The Jewish Telegraphic Agency's Washington bureau chief Ron Campeas tweeted something similar, saying, quote, left-wing Jewish Twitter is now, don't accuse us of operating in bad faith because we assumed the Trump administration is operating in bad faith, and not realizing the problem. Jumping to conclusions without data isn't helping anyone, end quote. There are a couple of other things to note here. First off, this conversation about Jews being a nationality is already complicated. For many Jews in the United States, Judaism is only a religion. So the idea of the United States saying Judaism is a nationality would be literally the government telling these Jews how they are or are not Jewish. The thing is, there are also a lot of Jews who see Judaism as a religion and a nationality, and the Jewish people as an ethnic group. Full disclosure, I am one of those people. I happen to think that the reduction of Jewish identity to a religion alone is grossly inaccurate, and honestly a construction of Western and American society. So some people who think like I do welcomed the idea that the United States would be laying out what to them is just true, that Jews are a nationality. So all of this helped the outrage at the executive order grow as well, before anyone had a chance, again, to look at the actual text and see that no one was saying Judaism is now a nationality. And I'll just say, having been honest about my viewpoint, if Trump had said Judaism is a nationality now, I would disagree, because though I hold that perspective, I also see this as an internal Jewish conversation, and one that no state entity, other than maybe Israel, should be messing in. The second thing to note is that the executive order bases its definition of anti-Semitism on one put together by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which is a coalition of 33 countries meant to address anti-Semitism. The IRA definition, as it is commonly referred to, has already been adopted by a number of countries and student organizations, and there are only two parts of the IRA definition in use here that are legitimately raising eyebrows. One bit says that denying Jewish self-determination and saying Israel is a racist endeavor is anti-Semitic, and another bit saying that applying double standards to Israel's actions as compared to those of other countries is also anti-Semitic. The reason this is raising eyebrows is because this language could be used to pull federal funding from colleges or programs that allow members of the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, or BDS movement against Israel. Calling Israel racist and, in the eyes of critics, holding Israel to a double standard are somewhat normal for the BDS movement. And I say critics here because I know members of the BDS movement would disagree with the idea that they hold Israel to a double standard. And in fact, this executive order was signed by Trump on Wednesday, December 11th, pretty explicitly as a way to address anti-Semitism from the BDS movement that Jewish students on college campuses face. Free speech advocates and pro-Palestinian activists say that this executive order could infringe on students' freedom of speech to criticize Israel and is deliberately targeting pro-Palestinian activists. This is part of a much longer conversation about free speech on campus and the BDS movement, but the potential of this executive order should be taken into account. And finally, there is a much longer conversation to also be had on how the Jewish community focuses in on and sees anti-Semitism and anti-Israel activism on college campuses. In the podcast notes for this episode, I'll leave a link to a great article in the foreword that talks about some of the recent studies that show that there really isn't as much anti-Semitism on college campuses as we necessarily think there is, and that Jewish students on the whole are more safe than we think they are. Now, there is something to be said for a president who takes the time to sign an executive order related to campus anti-Semitism based on Israel, but who seems to have done very little to address the kind of anti-Semitism that has literally killed Jews. And with that, I want to pivot to the other major story of last week that got overshadowed by the Jewish reaction to Trump's executive order. On Tuesday, December 10th, a kosher grocery store in Jersey City, New Jersey, was attacked by two shooters. After a shootout with police, the two people were killed, but as a result of their attack, 4 people died. The co-owner of the store and a young man shopping there, both Jewish, and an employee of the store and a police officer who was killed before the shooters stormed the grocery store, both non-Jewish. In the aftermath of the Jersey City shooting, there was a kind of tension between Jews trying to figure out whether this was an anti-Semitic attack and the law enforcement and government officials who didn't give an immediate answer to that question. On one hand, the delay is justified because an investigation takes time. On the other hand, we need to know when an anti-Semitic attack has taken place. It didn't help that later in the evening of December 10th, Stephen Fulop, the mayor of Jersey City, tweeted, quote, "Based on our initial investigation, which is ongoing, we now believe the active shooters targeted the location they attacked. Due to an excess of caution, the community may see additional police resources in the days and weeks ahead. We have no indication there are any further threats," end quote. The phrase, "targeted the location they attacked," produced even more anxiety because it wasn't clear if Fulop was saying that yes, this was a deliberate anti-Semitic attack, or just that the shooters decided to go for the kosher store for unknown reasons. A day later, though state and federal authorities say they didn't want to say that they knew the motive of the shooters, Fulop tweeted that the attack was deliberately against the Jewish community. And now, as more details come out, we know this is true. What complicates this story is that, as opposed to the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh in 2018 and the shooting at a Chabad synagogue in Poway, California earlier in 2019, the perpetrators of the shooting in Jersey City are not white supremacists. They've been tied to an extremist faction of a group called the Black Hebrew Israelites, which generally refers to black people who say they are descended from the ancient Israelites. Now, calling the Black Hebrew Israelites a group is like calling Jews a group. It's too simplistic. Like any other group, there are all kinds of Black Hebrew Israelites, most of whom are not extremists. But the shooters in Jersey City apparently agreed with the ideology of this extremist faction that says black people are the real Jews and the white people that say they're Jews are evil liars and imposters. So, they decided to attack a kosher grocery store. This is a story in which Jews were killed by weaponized anti-Semitism, and I can't escape the fact that most of the Jewish outcry and attention was given to the misunderstood executive order by Trump last week instead of this story. Why? Well, there could be any number of reasons. The shooting took place in a community of ultra-Orthodox Jews, and ultra-Orthodox Jews have been getting regularly harassed and attacked, often by Black and Hispanic people in New York City. The fact that this doesn't center around white nationalism and this isn't so clear-cut in terms of motive may make it easy to ignore for the many Jews who equate anti-Semitism mostly with white supremacy. The fact that this is hate directed towards ultra-Orthodox Jews may leave it off the radar for the mostly non-Orthodox Jewish population in America. And maybe there's something to be said for the delay in authorities confirming that yes, the attack on the kosher grocery store was deliberate targeting of Jews, Or maybe many of us are just more attuned to Trump-related news than other kinds of news. It's something to reflect on. And in that vein, I think it's worth it to read something Amy Spiro, a Jerusalem-based Jewish journalist, tweeted last Wednesday, December 11th. Quick warning, there is some harsh language here. Spiro said, quote, "Anti-Semitism is not right-wing. Anti-Semitism is not left-wing. Anti-Semitism is not Christian or Muslim. Anti-Semitism is not new, nor is it making a comeback. If you only give a shit about the Jews when it fits into your worldview, then you don't actually care at all. If you don't care about Hasidic Jews assaulted in Brooklyn, if you don't care about French Jews beaten in Paris, if you don't care about Israeli Jews stabbed inside a synagogue, then spare me your hand-wringing, your op-ed writing, your tweets, and your thoughts and prayers." End quote. This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringauz. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and hopefully next week the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com.